Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Trio. The subject of today's discussion is the film The Godfather and its sequels, The Godfather Part 2 and The Godfather Part 3. The Godfather was released 52 years ago, and yet it still has a loyal following of fans. We are going to discuss the films and why they are still so popular.
Awesome! I love it. I love it. Been looking forward to this conversation. I've read the book The Godfather decades ago. I've seen all the movies multiple times. Anxiously awaited the release. Certainly the third one. Wasn't going to the theaters when the first ones came out, but I have rented or owned them on whether it be VHS or DVD multiple times, and just love them. So looking forward to the conversation today.
I I am very fond of all three of the Godfather movies. I have not read the book The Godfather in its entirety, but I am very familiar with all three films. I have Blu-ray discs of all three movies, and while I think the first two are in a different strata, I think all three of them are excellent movies, and I certainly believe that they have remained as popular as you suggest, Andrew. And I guess why don't you start out? Why do you, Andrew, think that the Godfather movies have maintained their popularity all this time?
I'd like to answer that question two ways. First is simply The Godfather is a great film with almost not one single wasted frame. That's the simplistic answer. The more complex answer is the movie operates on so many levels and operates well on so many levels. You've got the interpersonal relationship between Michael and Kay. You've got the family dynamics. You've got the dynamics between the families and their rival families. You've got the fact that basically all of the activity on screen is illegal. I mean, everybody on screen except for the wives are criminals. There's just so much going on. I mean, you got the whole Machiavellian angle, and it's a super complex movie, and it all works. So you can just kick it back and say, yeah, that was a great film. I thoroughly enjoyed it. Or you can sit there and dissect it and say, wow, this is like a maze, and every corridor you go down is fantastic.
Well, and I'd add on to that by saying not only is there a lot that's going on, but the plots and the writing itself weave it together, and identify how connected all these different pieces are. Again, I didn't see The Godfather in the theaters. This was 72, 74. I was too young to be going to those kind of movies. I can remember though, Mike, when Uncle Bob was talking to us about what's this Godfather movie, and all he said was, he says, there's a lot of talking. That's how he described it. He said you probably wouldn't like it. It said there's a lot of talking in the movie, and obviously there's some incredibly violent scenes in the movie. There's some violence in the movie, but the parts of the movie that really draw you in and catch you it's talking, mainly men around a table or standing somewhere or in the midst of something, either planning or discussing what has happened or giving orders, or just existing in this environment of theirs. It's a lot of talking, yet it's a lot of very powerful talking that is going on.
Well, I actually remember the conversation you described with our uncle. And one of the reasons why, an 11 or 12-year-old boy would be curious about these things is because these were R-rated movies. And so there was, why was that? And one of the scenes before I ever saw it that I recall him describing was when Luca Brasi was, strangled.
Oh, yes.
And he was describing the way that his eyes were bulging as just sort of a exceptional performance as an actor, because just whatever it was that caused his eyes during the filming of that scene to bulge the way they were was something that was unusual. But I certainly agree, Mark, with what you were saying about the fact that it really is it's talking. I mean, the substance of the movie is really, in some ways, kind of above the heads of prepubescent people, or just immature people, younger children, for
Yeah.
lack of a better way of putting it. And as to what you were saying, Andrew, I mean, I think that kind of a broad way of characterizing what you said is that the movie The Godfather, as well as the three films combined, it really does kind of rise to the level of Shakespearean or even Greek tragedy.
Oh yes.
I mean, and that's maybe kind of a trite way of describing it, but I think it's true. It's just that the level of complexity and the characters who are, have conflicted motivations, and not necessarily, bright line choices in terms of the right or wrong thing to do, given the fact that, as you say, they're all criminals, and
Hmm.
and what they're doing, and there's a certain honor among thieves or whatever you want to
Including the
call it.
Catholic priests and
Um,
bishops.
Yeah.
and I mean, certainly Vito Corleone. I think most people would say there's a certain honor in how he chose to do things, and people didn't get punished if they didn't have it coming,
Right.
and
Oh yeah.
and the pun and the retribution or justice that was provided was commensurate with
Hmm.
what the person had done, and blah blah blah. Uh, but complexity, and overlapping interrelationships, and what the it's like, were there any good choices? Were there any good choices really in these various scenarios that the characters had? I mean, certainly there were better choices, or with the benefit of hindsight, mistakes that were made in the choices that were made. But uh,
But you're
the
setting up one of the best lines in the movie. That was the business they had chosen.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And that's, I, I look at all these movies, but if we start with The Godfather, which was the first one that I saw, even though the first two were out, I'd read the book The Godfather before I saw the movies, and then I saw the movie The Godfather. That I believe that there's a couple key aspects that really make, let's just focus on this movie for a second, great. The first thing is, it was the ability in this movie to very rapidly get you to understand who these people were and what they were doing. It's like, I believe in America. You hear this while it's dark, and then it pans out, and you have someone coming to the Godfather, Vito Corleone, with a request, and they do a very good job of because of the relationship that the two of these people have, and how Vito kind of sets it up for him about how you should have approached this in the beginning, and this is what I do, and this is how I treat my friends. That's all explained very quickly and very well, just right up front in the first few minutes of the movie. And then you're kind of moving back and forth then between this session where this is going on in the wedding. So you have, now we're talking about someone who's part of not just a mafia family, but a larger family, which ends up having a lot of impact for the plot and the characters later on. So I think that the movie does an amazing job of showing a picture of who we're dealing with very quickly in the movie. And then the second piece is especially focusing on Vito Corleone, who I believe is one of the greatest characters of all movies in all of history. Right? His character, and how he was portrayed as someone who is an evil person, yet he's also a good and benevolent person. He's a gangster, yet he is a family man, and the way that was all brought together. Interesting. That character, the character of Vito Corleone, it was for about 50 years the only character to win two Oscars by two different people.
Oh wow.
between Marlon Brando winning for it as best actor, and then Robert De Niro as best supporting actor playing the same character, right? That wasn't replicated again for almost 50 years, and it was the Joker from the Batman sequence that was the
Not
uh,
quite the same.
you know, not quite the same, but there's a lot of people that would argue those were amazing performances on that as well. Different type of movie. Not here to discuss that. My point being, the character of Vito Corleone was an incredibly powerful and central character that drove so much of the activity, not just within his family, but these other families were clearly concerned about, was he on their side or not on their side, because having him on their side meant a lot, and having him against them also meant a lot, right? And specifically Vito, not just the family. So a very very powerful character, and I think that's an important aspect of why the movie The Godfather and then the subsequent things were really so powerful.
Well, I agree, Mark, with both your points about the setup of the movie and the the sort of the crime family and the biological family and the sort of blurry line between those two things. That's presented in the setup of the movie, and certainly also the significance of the character of Vito Corleone in the story. But I don't want to let this go. Andrew brought up the line, and it's sort of the first quote from the movie that came up in our conversation here about this is the business we've chosen. And before I retired, I worked as a circuit court judge in Wisconsin, a trial court judge. And there was a jury trial that I presided over. And before the trial got going, it was a lawsuit, and an insurance company was involved, and an injured person. And before the trial got going, there were four lawyers and an adjuster from the insurance company, and it was the court clerk and the stenographer, the court reporter, were all back in my office around a conference table. And the lawyer for the insurance company wanted me to make a ruling that would not allow some aspect of the situation to be presented in front of the jury. And he sort of said, because I got a hard enough time, making insurance companies not look bad without having to deal with this. And before any of the other lawyers could chime in, I said, John, his name was John. I said, John, this is the business you've chosen. and it's going to the staying power of culturally that the Godfather movies have managed to continue all this time. Everybody in the room knew what I was talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and the other lawyers sort of laughed and said, oh yeah, I just watched Godfather 2 the other night. I mean, it was so it's the vernacular of the Godfather has become something that has cultural significance beyond the story and the narrative of the Godfather movies.
Well, and of course, that line was from The Godfather Part Two. But across all of the movies, there were lines that were that were in place. Some which have caught on, I think, because they were. I mean, leave the gun and take the cannolis is almost like a humorous line that that a lot of people think of, and it's kind of a but it really relays something pretty powerful to what was going on at the at the time, and and then through the some really I guess, I mean, I think that the line this is the business we have chosen is not only the best of all the Godfather movies, but it's one of the greatest lines in any movie ever. It gives such a clear picture into how these people lived with and dealt with the situations that they found themselves in, with incredibly high stakes, right, including to theirs and their families, personal health, a lot of money, right, legal exposure. I mean, incredibly high stakes, and it just was. We put up with this because this is the business we've shown. I love the line. Now I know that there's people that think that others are are more, more significant than that. But that's the one that I really think about the most, or has entered my mind the most since watching these movies.
Well, before getting back to Andrew, I think, and I don't want to get into politics because I don't think that this stuff can be summed up. It's more complex than just a movie line. But there's been discussion recently about the president bringing an end to the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and the idea that it can happen very quickly, it can get taken care of, and I got this under control, whatever. And what that conjures up in my mind is he's going to make him an offer he can't refuse. And I mean, and that's kind of what I think. It's like okay, either your brains or your signature will be on the peace treaty. I mean, so there's and these things have kind of permeated just the consciousness of how people look at the world and how people deal with each other and deal with themselves. I mean, Andrew, what are I mean, we're talking about lines from the movies. What's another line that you feel has kind of achieved that sort of cultural resonance, like some of the stuff we've already mentioned?
I'd like to backtrack slightly. You said that you were a circuit court judge. Did Vito Corleone carry you around in his pocket like so many nickels and dimes?
Well, there are some people where I live that when I was working thought that some other people locally here had me in their pocket. But
sure.
No is the straight answer.
One of my favorite lines, and I've said this to people outside of this trio, and very rarely do I find someone who doesn't know where it's from. If I do somebody a favor and they say, what do I owe you or something, and I'll just say, one day I will call upon you to do a service for me. Or no, actually, it's one day, and that day may never come. I will call upon you to do a service for me. Very rarely do I have somebody sitting there like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
They'll usually pick up on the Godfather reference instantly and be like, okay, yeah, that's cool. But yeah, I mean, there are.
Well, it's, to me, the lines that really give insight into how all this happens is what I find the most, most interesting, right? That give insights into like what's going on here. What are these people's motivations? And I think that there was a number of lines that that Vito, the Godfather, used in the first movie in conversations about whether they should or shouldn't get involved in the drug trade, and all that was around it. And just first in the meeting with Saluzzo, just basically said, look, this business is a little dirty, right? What you're in, don't get me wrong. Whatever a guy wants to do for a living, I'm not judging that. But and then when in the meeting of all the families that that took place at the Congress Hotel in Chicago, where they're making the peace and explaining it's his rationale. And then, I didn't want to get into the drug business, and I thought it was going to be bad, not just for us, but not now and in the future. So I believe that now, and I still believe that today. For how he was explaining his rationale, and again, that line, I believed it now, and after all that they've been through,
I believed that then, and I believe that now,
and I believe that now,
yeah.
And I just. Like the after all that everybody had been through, the ability to completely separate the loss of his son, the violence and loss of money that they had all had, and the bad blood, he was still able to go back and say, yeah, I'd make the same decision again. Looking at this because it's business.
But he does compromise. I mean, he's like,
yes.
I came here to reason together, and as a reasonable man, I'm going to do whatever's necessary, and he did, which was a more he was the most honorable of the men around the table, as far as
yes.
I can tell.
Yes,
and he made good on his pledge to live by the peace that was established at that meeting. But
And it's interesting as far as that scene, which is an incredibly important, obviously, scene in that movie, the meeting of the families to make that peace. I've actually seen different lists around where, quoting lines, and the line they seem to quote from that scene is about, you talk about vengeance. Is vengeance going to bring my son back to me or your son back to you, as the most significant, line in that scene. And well, obviously I disagree. I think there's a couple that are just more important than that. I also like the line when he's talking about bringing Michael back. And, it's like, we're making arrangements for this now. And, I forgive vengeance on, for my son. However,
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, if he should be shot trying to escape, or if he should hang himself in his cell, I'm going to blame some of the people in this room. And again, just completely clear picture into the mindset, that he has, not only what he's thinking about, but the messaging that he's providing into, if my son gets hung up in any of this stuff, some of you are going to die. Oh, yeah. That's what he's saying, which I find to be, very powerful lines.
Well, and he was shooting straight. He was dealing honestly with these other guys who he knew were had motivations that might be contrary to his. And he was, in that that I do not forgive. Then he sort of paused. But that aside, let me say that I swear. Just as long as you keep that in mind, we're cool.
Santino's death was business. The attempt on his life was business. But he's saying Michael's life, that's personal. Don't touch Michael. You touch Michael, all bets are off.
Well, and the line, it's not personal, it's business, is another line from when they're initially planning the killing of the police captain and Salat. So that's a very important part of that conversation, that look, you can't take this stuff personal, it's got to be business. Now, I believe, and this might be not a highlight, I believe it still was personal for Michael. I believe at that point in the movie, Mike still wasn't invested in joining the family and becoming a part of the crime family. I believe at that point, he was still solely focused on what is it going to take to keep Dad alive.
Yes.
That was his
100%.
That was his 100, and it wasn't business.
No.
It was, I'm going to do whatever I think it takes to keep my dad alive.
Yes.
And I don't think you have to take the progression from that point to when he had to flee the country, what he built, getting married in Sicily and seeing that come to a violent end, his brother getting killed, and I think that he had to go through all of that before he came back with a mindset of truly entering the family on the, to be a participant in the crime family. I think back at that point when he said it's not personal, it's business, I think it was personal.
Oh, yeah.
To Michael, and he was just trying to do what he had to do to convince the other members of the family that was the case.
There's like a boss in any business that has to deal with his employees. There's times where you have to choose someone out if you're a boss, but it doesn't mean you no longer like the person, where you have to come in and kind of take control of whatever's going on or take whatever. And that's easy for the boss to say, but the employee doesn't always look at it that way. I mean, being on the giving end when you've got when you're on the business end of applying business, sometimes the other person has no real elbow room to not take it personally, and sort of the not the false equivalency, but falsely separating those two things. And it's like, oh no, this isn't personal. I mean, is it's an amorphous concept, and in the it's a TV series that was on HBO, I think, Boardwalk Empire, which deals with mobsters.
Yeah.
Well, it deals with Atlantic City, New Jersey during Prohibition.
Right.
But there are like, mafia, like Italian mafiosos from New York and whatnot that get involved in the booze trade. And one of the characters is named Rossetti, an Italian from New York who gets involved in this, and it gets into this discussion of, this is business, not personal. He says, not personal. How could it not be personal?
Yeah.
And it just sort of like, are you crazy? What do you mean? That's bullshit. And but that's not to say that it is bullshit. It's just there's overlap.
Yeah.
Oh,
There is
huge, yeah.
there is overlap in those things. It's not just business or just personal. There's some overlap over those things.
Well, if we can bring in other movies, in the movie The Usual Suspects, there's a scene where the main character, whose name escapes me, says, "Hey, just so you know, that buddy of yours who was killed in prison, I'm the guy who killed him." And he says, "Okay, was it business or personal?" And he says, "A bit of both."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
Yeah, it's there's and it tends to be part of both, I think, in a lot of these situations. I also think that the line, "I don't like violence, it's a big expense," that Salazzo says, I also think that was an insincere line. For his, he was very clear in his actions. He had no problem using violence if that's what it took to advance, his deal or his position or whatever it is. In fact, he was really able to go pretty full ballistic very quickly when he didn't get the answer that he wanted. So one of those things like, yeah, I'd rather negotiate as long as you agree to everything that I say, which is that's how I'd rather do it. Well, wouldn't we all? But I found that to be a little disingenuous based on how he conducted himself.
So like I'm willing to work with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, so long as they're willing to vote for my bill and don't expect me to vote for theirs.
Yeah,
It's not to get politics involved in this again. But,
yeah.
Well, also with Salazzo, Don Vito doesn't say you can't traffic heroin. He just says, I'm not interested in participating.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it's not like Salazzo can say, well, okay, Don Vito's thwarting me. He's just saying, I'm not interested. And that means, obviously, I'm not going to tell my judge friends to go easy on your guys. But I mean, Salazzo is literally just saying, you do it my way or I'm going to kill you.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I think
your
that
son is more compliant. And if Sonny says no, I'll kill him too.
I think that the initial request that Stilazzo makes of Vito at their initial meeting towards, relatively early in the movie is, he needs cash. He says, I need someone with powerful friends. I need $1 million in cash. I need those, judges and politicians that you carry around in your pocket like so many nickels and dimes. And, and then when Vito says, so, finance, political protection. Political protection is part of the deal.
Oh yeah.
And the if Salazzo had been able to get the political protection from, Vito, then that would have been great. When he didn't get it, that was an obstacle in his ability to, have the degree of success that he was looking for in his new business. And so it wasn't quite as simple as just like, hey, we'll live and let live. There was sort of overlap. It's like, well, look, if you're keeping your political protection away from here, then then the cops are going to be down on us. It was sort of like the two different ways of doing things. And then Salazzo was sort of the new, we got to cut corners because this business here is too lucrative to pass up. And Don Corleone recognizes the peril in doing so. And, therein lie the rub.
Exactly. Well, and I heard you say once, Andrew, that there's a lot of the Godfather is really can be one of the ways to view the Godfather is a sequence of mistakes.
Yes.
And I think that in the scene where they're discussing the deal with Saluzzo and Vito is providing his answer that he is not going to participate. We really see one of the first big mistakes, or at least where the movie really pauses for a second to make sure people understand this was a mistake, and that was Sonny entering the conversation, kind of like, oh, are you going to tell me that you're going to guarantee security? And the filmmaking takes you around to all the different characters that were in the meeting, showing kind of a not overly happy look on their face, with the exception of Saluzzo, who he kind of looks up, and the idea that this was a mistake that Sonny just made, which obviously ends up having all kinds of ramifications farther on down in the movie.
Well, and earlier in the movie, before the meeting, when Tom Hagen is talking to Vito about you got to give Salazzo a meeting sometime next week, and Hagen counsels in favor of taking the deal, and he's not. I mean, he's and he lays it out in a fairly objective and relatively reasonable manner. Look, here's what's going on. We don't get a piece of that action now. And he's looking forward 10 years. It's gonna be a problem. And then eventually, Salazzo tells Tom Hagen, it's like, Sonny was hot for my deal, and you knew it was the right thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I.
Okay, wait, Mike, I hate to interrupt you, but does that imply that at some point Tom Hagen made a slip? Or, why does Salazzo know that Hagen thought it was the right thing to do?
I'm not sure. I guess
I have an answer. First of all, it was very clear that Salazzo knew the role that Hagen played in the family, because when the meeting started, it became clear that everybody on the Corleone side already knew what the meeting was going to be about. And in fact, Salazzo kind of tipped his glass to Hagen, salute, kind of like, you did your job in researching this, making sure that nobody walked into this meeting not knowing what it was going to be about. And I think that Salazzo knew that Hagen analytically looked at all the different factors here and came to the conclusion that, understanding where he sat in the family, that it was the right thing to do. Because from a business perspective, it probably was, right? The right thing to do. I think that that Vito had held on to a way of doing business which he was attached to, and and the people around, and unfortunately the world around was changing to step past just delivering on these things that everybody wants to do anyway, and the law just prevents people from doing, like gambling and prostitution, to something bigger and
harmless vices.
Harmless vices, as opposed to vices that become much more destructive. And to say, well, I don't want to be involved with that, it kind of fast forwards to this is the business that we have chosen. If you're going to be in this business, you're going to have to move into this area. Otherwise, you're just going to be completely out financed. Yeah. You sooner or later, I couldn't afford to stop. The guy's talking about paying his own people not to participate in the drug trade. But it was the right thing to do from a purely business perspective. But when you listen to Vito Corleone's explanation, you can understand why he didn't want to get the family involved with it.
When Michael is having dinner with Salazzo and Captain McCluskey, I mean, right before he shoots them both, and Salazzo, says, "I'm going to speak to Michael in Italian," and I don't speak Italian, but he at one point Sollozzo says, tu padre pensa antique, and your father thinks old.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's a relatively accurate translation of at least that part of, and it's like he's, look, this is, and later at even Michael, and it's in a much different context, but he's talking to Kay, and he says, look, my father's way of doing things is over. Even he knows that.
Yeah.
Now that was kind of bullshit, because Michael was kind of up for doing things the more modern way, as it turns out, to the extent that he could. Although he was conflicted, and maybe that's one of the key aspects of the whole story. The Michael becoming a man like he never wanted to become. The type of man like his father, who he never wanted to be like, and so there's definitely there's conflict in Michael, which I think is something that most people would agree on. But that's my father's way of doing things is over. Even he knows that.
Yeah.
But if only we had someone who had experience, say, as a judge, to get their input. Mike, Corleone's hang up with the drug trafficking is basically this: he's got judges on his payroll, and he knows that if his guys get busted doing something other than probably murder, the judge is going to go easy on him. And he does not want to approach these judges who have an image of being an honest man of integrity and say, I need you to cut some slack to guys who are moving heroin. He does not want to upset his relationship with these judges, the money aside, by asking them to do something that they're not inclined to do.
Well, and I hope that you'll both, or anybody else, will believe me that I didn't have people that, because of my friendship with them, they expected me to make rules.
I get that. I'm not saying you did.
So I don't. The most of the things that a trial level judge does involve the exercise of discretion, meaning there isn't a black or white answer that the law provides to what needs to happen in a particular case. Now, the law does set up guidelines, criteria, and things to take into account when coming up with the answer, or as they say, exercising discretion. And there, that really comes down to just, what does the judge feel? What does the judge believe? How, when you look at these various criteria, what's the right answer? And different judges come up with different answers that are based on the proper criteria. And if they articulate their thought process on the record properly, more often than not, their exercise of discretion will be maintained, even though an appellate court might take a different view. And so the sort of influences, whether it be other people, just a particular philosophy, or a political ideology, or whether they're an industrious judge or a lazy judge. I mean, there's all these different factors that can come in. And there are various lines that individual judges set up for themselves in terms of how they're going to exercise their discretion. And I think that what Vito Corleone believed was that, the unions, gambling, women, liquor, well, look, you can't legislate morality, and while I can't condone that, I'm not going to get my undies in a bundle over it. But and one thing I do know, after working as a judge, that people from other places who bring drugs into a community, most law enforcement officers and most judges don't like it. And it's a more destructive, it's just a more destructive thing than the fact that street crime, whether it be, stealing or the fact
selling
that
untaxed cigarettes or
whatever it is, that's. But and another thing is and this is kind of a tangent to the question you asked, but when it's just the mobsters that are where the violence is within, they're not killing civilians. Like when Clemenza, well, what about Michael? Is, oh no, it's okay. Clemenza or Sollozzo knows he's a civilian and uses that term. So he's safe. They're not going to mess with him. And so whatever the mobs were doing amongst themselves, the drug trade involved other people. It brought the civilians in, and they, drug addicts were their customers, and the vulnerable people in the community would become their client base because of their addiction to opiate drugs and whatnot. Opiate drugs are something, heroin dealers, most judges in Wisconsin don't like them.
Yeah.
Don't like them.
I mean, that you look back to, when these movies were made, although they were set in a much earlier time period, the early 70s was the initiation of the war on drugs. And I think the viewers back then were, the notion of heroin and these types of things was being brought up as a very significant problem in cities. And I think that, most people would identify that, drugs bad, worse than some of these other things. And that's clearly what the characters, certainly in the Corleone family, Vito Corleone, certainly felt. I think if anything, he was probably trying to hold off on getting involved in this, with some understanding that eventually it's going to have to happen, but potentially they can retain some of the strength and influence that they have, while some other people get themselves into a little bit more difficult situations. Is how he probably saw it.
I mean, and you mentioned that point that Andrew has made in the past about there's various mistakes that are made by the characters in The Godfather, and I guess there's two comments I'd make on that point. Number one, as far as what you just said, Mark, I mean, I kind of interpret that to mean that if Vito had kind of taken the same approach with Sollozzo that ended up being the agreement at the meeting at the Congress Hotel, that things would have gone better for the family, both in their relationship with the other families and Sollozzo, and just their sort of making a smoother transition from the way things had been to the way that things were in the process of becoming. And this isn't maybe the best analogy, but just the general idea of the various characters over the course of the films make various mistakes. I think that it's not out of line to that, like chess. The person who's gonna mistakes are made, and that's what loses a chess game. And you've got some of the smartest in terms of just raw intellect and most game playing minded people on the planet get into these international chess tournaments, and one of them's going to make a mistake, whether it's based on the tendencies of the other player or either a lack of awareness of the tendency of the other player, or the player that knows the tendency of the other player will sort of invite them to make a mistake. But it's you've got to move. I mean, when you're playing chess, it's okay, your move. Well, you got to do something, and there's only so many options available to do things, and there may be do you have to sacrifice your queen, or do you have to do this, or do you play it aggressive, or do you play it conservative?
Yeah, some of those mistakes don't. They wouldn't even be seen as a mistake until farther on down the line. I mean, I look, yes, the Don eventually said, look, get everybody together. This was after Sonny was killed. Let's get everybody together. This war ends now. He obviously was an intelligent person who 10 minutes before he learned that Sonny had been killed, knew the position the family was in, knew what they were up against, but wasn't stepping up and saying, we should end this war now. right?
No.
There was a series of events, and one of them being that he might have known that there was no way he was going to be able to draw Sonny down from from where he was, and the way that other people now were looking at Sonny, right? So it was the death of Sonny not only that compelled the Godfather, but I think allowed the Godfather to say, we're going to end this war right now, right? Again, a lot of events kind of have to happen before people see, okay, this is an opening for us now. And I think that's what that created. For that, the desire to get Michael back, the unending view of when this war was going to gonna end. But I really think that there's a notion of he might have had a hard time, standing down Sonny before the war. I mean, and Sonny saw himself, the only way I get out of this is by winning.
Right.
Sonny had no intention of probably because he wasn't going to be able to negotiating any type of peace. At the bottom of the stairs there, he's looking at Tom. He's like, help me win. Just help me win. I think that was the only out that he had. He never would have been able to negotiate. He didn't have the respect. He didn't have the influence or anything like that Vito did. Sonny could not have gone into the Congress Hotel and negotiated that peace.
He didn't have the temperament.
Dead.
No, he didn't. He didn't have the temperament, but he also didn't have
a lousy hand.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
But he didn't have the connections and the respect of the other people around the table. He didn't have the trust of the other people around the table. And that's why, another thing, going back to your original kind of how this started, I think that he may have been more compelled. I'm talking about, Vito Corleone would have been more compelled to make this deal at the beginning if it was with one of the other five families and not this guy, Sollozzo, who he hadn't done business with before and was just coming in from the outside. He had some support of the Tattaglia family and obviously the Barzini family, but he was an unknown quantity. And putting this much of a risk and trust into him is not something that, whereas if Tattaglia or Barzini or someone would have come to the Don directly to say, we've got to move in this direction, this is where this stuff is going, he might have had a different answer from the beginning.
Okay. And Barzini could have gone to him and said, listen, Vito, let's call a meeting.
Yes.
Yeah, this can't be between you and me. We've got to get everybody involved.
Yeah.
I never thought of that. Yeah, Sollozzo was too small time for Vito.
Or even just, regardless of his size, they had not done business before.
Yeah, he was an outsider.
Because if you remember, Tom Hagen had to fill the Don in on who this guy even was. Right? So clearly the Don had not done any business with him before, had no basis of trust.
He had to
with
say,
him.
You've got to give him a meeting.
Yes. That's that's it.
At the time of the first meeting with Sollozzo, it was known that the Tattaglia family was behind him with all their people. That was known by Vito. And, as far as Barzini's involvement, it wasn't until the meeting at the Congress Hotel where, and then afterwards, Vito and Tom Hagen are talking.
Yeah.
And Vito, so you mean the Tattaglia people? And it's like, no, Barzini. It's like, it wasn't until this very day that I knew that it was Barzini all along.
Yeah.
And then he calls Tattaglia a pimp.
Yeah, he never could have outfought Santino.
Never could have outfought it. So I think that I agree with what you said, Mark, that if there had been more involvement of the other families and they could have come together, but I don't think Vito at the outset knew that there was anybody other than the Tattaglias that were behind Sollozzo.
And he didn't respect.
And he didn't have the same level of respect. And so I think you're right. What you said about it, Barzini had come to Vito, contemporaneously with the initial contact with Sollozzo, that would have potentially caused Vito to take an approach more along the lines of what he did later after Sonny's death at the time of the meeting.
So, and I mean, that portrays kind of looking at how looking back at how it eventually came together, turned out to be a huge mistake on Barzini's fault. On his part, right? Saying, let's bring this other guy in, Tattaglia, you are going to have the kind of this front man role, but we need to get Corleone involved, right? As opposed to just working it out as the families. They kind of tried to do an end around that this guy's Saluzzo is gonna front all these things, and obviously in the end that turned out to be a bit of a mistake for Barzini as he rolled down the steps of that hall after he was shot at the end.
And this comes back to the whole complexity of The Godfather. You've got Vito's arrogance, and he was arrogant. He tried to be reasonable, but he was arrogant.
Yes.
He thought he could do it as he wished. And Barzini's resentment that he couldn't stand the fact that Corleone was more powerful than him. And that's why they couldn't have a sit down and say, how are we going to handle the drug trade?
Yeah, exactly. And you end up with all this killing, right? That ends up coming to pass.
It's so unnecessary.
Just now thinking about this whole time frame and this
good subtle quote there, Andrew.
Yeah. If taking a look at this, I mean, the Don clearly felt that Santino was a good fighter, right? That Tattaglia never could have outfought Santino. He was a good fighter. But if Michael was not away, and we had this notion of, okay, who's going to be a better Don, Sonny or Michael, who would have been the better Don? If it was between the two of them, obviously we had away Michael. Sonny had his time as the acting while the father was recovering, and we saw how that went. We saw when Michael came on board. But let's kind of rearrange the time sequence again. So if you had to choose between the two of them, who would be a better Don? What do you think, Ian?
Okay, the question about what happens if Santino and Michael are both alive. I've put some thought into this. If you look at the book, Santino was going to kill the heads of the other four families just as Michael did. But Carlo's betrayal got Santino killed, and that was the end of that. So you've got two basic alternate worlds. One where Santino kills the other four heads of the families, and then Michael comes home to a New York where the survivors of the four families are subordinate to the Corleones. Or he comes back to New York where Santino wasn't killed, but Vito recovered his health and said, hey, let's put a stop to this. And they'd be slightly different because in one case, the Corleone family is dominant, and in the other case, they're kind of diminished slightly. But my theory, what would Don Vito do with Santino the hothead and Michael the smart guy? And I'm going to defer to the book again, but in the book, Puzo makes it very clear Santino was hot for the drug trade, not just because of the money potential, but because he was too big for his britches. He was chafing under his father's leadership, and he wanted something he could do himself. And he saw the drug trade as an operation that he would be in charge of. So
it was something for me.
A little something on my own. So I'm thinking Vito would look at it and say, okay, Sonny, you're going to run the drug trade for us. Michael, you're going to take care of family business, especially the stuff where we try to look legitimate. And then when Michael says the place to be is Nevada, he would move to Nevada. He'd set himself up in Tahoe and take over Las Vegas. And Santino, Tessio, and Clemenza would stay in New York, run New York for the Corleones, and run the drug trade. That's my theory. But I don't see Vito saying to Sonny, I'm going to step over you and promote Michael to the head of the family. As much love as there was between the brothers, I don't think there was that much love. I think Sonny would lose it. And, and I'm not saying he would react violently, but he would hold a serious grudge.
Yeah.
He would not be a happy person.
Well, and I mean, Michael, aside from participation in a couple meetings leading up to the assassination of the police captain and Saluzzo, he'd had no interaction with the family business whatsoever.
Oh yeah.
No. I mean, he grew up in this household where things were happening, and you and there was lessons he learned from his father and that type of thing. But the day to day,
your enemies closer.
exactly. But the day to day operations of the business, the contacts, the connections, the hierarchy of the organization, the partnerships and alliances with other families and law enforcement, and I mean, he had none of that, right? In fact, they talked, that's part of the movie after Michael comes back and this work that they're doing to try to get him introduced and caught up with all these things was a challenge.
Yeah.
That they were working with. So it would be, he would have had to work with him for a while to make that happen. And then I agree with you. Sonny would have to be responsible for something, and putting him in charge of the foot soldiers in the organization with Clemenza and Tessio and all of their teams. That makes sense. I can see that as an outcome that would have been possible if Sonny hadn't been assassinated.
Right.
And this is a kind of it's a complex question to answer, because in my mind, clearly Michael, given his temperament and intellect, etc., was he was better suited to the role of the Don, of the head of the family, and sort of the hot temperament of Sonny. It created problems, and it would have been difficult for Sonny to sort of take the baton from his father, Vito, and maintain anything like, or at least to maintain the same form of leadership and business and structure, etc. It wouldn't have worked. But with all that said, I believe that Vito would have selected Sonny if it was a question. And I like Andrew's theory about sort of a hybrid. I'm going to find distinct roles for these two of my sons, each suited to their particular characteristics. I mean, I like that. But I believe he would have picked Sonny, and there's two reasons. One is that later in the movie, when sort of after Michael has, Sonny is gone, Michael's back from Sicily, and he's starting to kind of do the work of he's the front man for the family, and Vito is in kind of semi-retirement. Well, there's the scene where Michael and Vito are kind of out behind the house, and Vito's drinking a glass of wine, and they're talking, and Vito says, look, I knew that Santino was going to have to go through this, and Fredo, but I wanted something different for you, Senator Corleone, Governor Corleone. So I think that if Michael had never, if he hadn't shot Sollozzo and Captain McCluskey and had to, go hide in Sicily for however long he was gone, and it stayed around, there wouldn't have been this, that Michael would have probably stayed out of the fray and remained a civilian, and Vito would have been he would have been advocating for Michael. No, don't get involved in the family business. We're going to open up a new wing in the legitimate world that you're going to be the spearhead of. And
I can see the which is, it's a little bit of what that's actually kind of a slight derivation of what Andrew said, kind of the same thing. This idea that Santino is going to stay in charge of the illegitimate pieces of the business, but we need to move the family into legitimate ways. The illegal side of the business is becoming much more risk-filled and uncertain. So we're going to build a more secure future. You're going to lead that, Michael. I can see, Vito saying Michael will not get involved in any family business. Clearly, when he learned about which was another great scene, when he learned that it was Michael who had done the shooting in the first place, and he's on his bed and he just
Yeah.
Not even a line, just a gesture with his hand that is as powerful as many of the lines in the movie. But he clearly did not want that for Michael, and you probably would have seen, something or something in between, whether it's sending him out to Vegas for the casinos or some other aspect of a legitimate angle of the business, or pushing him up through the political ladder. It's like, you need to run for state senator, and then you need to do this and do that, and potentially who's, it's hard to say. But with Santino gone, and the experiences that Michael had been through, in Italy, losing the woman that he'd married, and then learning about Sonny's death, and coming back, and now it was him and a weakened Vito Corleone. It's almost like the die was cast for him on what he was going to
The
with Santino dead, yeah, he was screwed.
Yeah.
Yeah, Mike made a good point though. I was thinking that killing Sollozzo McCluskey was kind of the point of no return for Michael, but there were no repercussions. I mean, he came back; he was never even charged.
Yeah.
So yeah, I can see where Corleone would say, "You're not getting involved anymore."
Well,
and the image is still clean.
Even
though we know it's not, your image is still clean.
In the book, which they didn't touch on at all in the movie, but in the book they explained how they got Michael back. Where there was another family who had a similar situation where they had this son who didn't want to stand up for himself. He was kind of a cast aside from the family, and at some point he got pissed at somebody and just walked up to him and shot him in the face or something. I mean, and the family was kind of like, "Oh, we never know you had this in you." Well, anyway, this guy, it was a very public thing. The guy was going to jail for life, or the chair or whatever. And so they talked to him, and he copped for the Sollozzo thing. So they explained, it's like, no, he's free and clear of these charges now.
Oh, yeah.
Right. And, coming back to the United States, there would have been the opportunity to say for the Don to say, you will not be getting involved in the business, and regardless of how his mindset had changed and that type of thing, we've got other plans for you, which they'd had for Michael.
The other thought process that I went through, thinking about, well, what would if Vito is sort of going to pass the baton, Sonny's still alive, and Michael is there. And I don't think anybody, just as a real quick aside, I don't think anybody really disagrees with the fact that he would not have, Fredo wasn't in the running.
Yeah.
Fredo wasn't going to be in the running.
Nobody was putting any money on Fredo.
And
he's got a good heart, but he's weak and he's stupid.
Yeah.
Yes.
And Vito knew that. But and this, I don't want to get in trouble, but it's another political analogy. I think that he would have picked Sonny, kind of like when President Biden withdrew from his candidacy for president, and then there was, well, who's going to be the Democratic nominee, and it very quickly was identified as the vice president, Vice President Harris. And I don't know what the real reason was. It doesn't necessarily matter at this point, but I believe it was just stepping over. That would be either casting the vice president aside or stepping over the vice president was just thought to be so disruptive within the Democratic Party that they just said, fuck it, we're just going to do it. And I'm not trying to suggest that Vito Corleone's thought process would have been anything like, the Democratic Party in the United States in 2024.
But Sonny was the heir apparent. It would have been the heir apparent.
It would have been just so disruptive of the way that circumstances had flowed for so long, for Vito just to determine, nah, Sonny, he's too much of a hothead. I need my son Michael, who's going to be more like me. And thanks for all you've done, Sonny, but You know,
Yeah.
you can go pick someone up at
That
the airport or whatever. You know, that wouldn't have worked. Wouldn't have worked.
No,
Wouldn't have
and
worked.
but what Andrew proposed would have been
Yeah.
possible, especially
Well,
if it would have been, we're going to let you do something, Sonny, that you wanted to do that I didn't.
no, I agree that works, and it's
Yeah,
consistent with all three of the characters, Vito, Sonny, and Michael. You know, Michael showed a willingness, or if not a desire, to
yeah,
become involved with the family business. Sonny was hot for the big money maker, you know, the drug trade, and Vito eventually, when the rubber hit the road, was not unwilling to compromise, you know, for the greater good, or at least to acknowledge the reality of what was going on.
mm-hmm.
And if you look at what happened to the mafia, boy, was that forecast accurate.
Uh-huh.
Because the feds used drug trafficking to break the mafia.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it did. Yes, seems like Vito was had his shit together on what would happen once they sunk into that.
But
well,
that's when guys started to flip.
Mm-hmm.
The whole
well,
thing of, you get caught, you keep your mouth shut, you do your time. All of a sudden, I'm going to be in prison for the rest of my life if I don't talk.
Yeah.
Then guys wanted to talk.
Well, and there's that kind of gives rise to a question. You know, there are, you know, reality is not. I mean, it's not 100% fictional creation. The story of The Godfather.
Oh,
I mean,
no.
there are in fact, and the point I'm trying to get at is that some of the characters in The Godfather are clearly tailored after real people. I mean, I think the two most obvious in the first the original Godfather film are, you know, Johnny Fontaine, patterned after Frank Sinatra, and then Mo Green, patterned after Bugsy Siegel.
Mm-hmm.
And I, you know, I've been on the internet, and there are websites where they have actual mafia figures for a lot of the characters, including Vito and Michael and others. And you know, I don't want to just sort of cop someone else's, you know, work to say this or that, but just a general, you know, familiarity with The Godfather and the history of the mafia. I think those two characters are very clearly patterned after real people. Not that Sinatra was a mobster, but there was some elbow rubbing that occurred. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
and also there was some issue with a contract with a band leader early in Sinatra's career, and I don't know all the details of that. But I mean, is there any question that Johnny Fontaine, it was not intentionally made to be a stand-in for Sinatra? I mean, any question about that?
No, I don't think so. And I think the movie was From Here to Eternity. Oh. And, you know, there's a lot of things there. It's not, I mean, it's not just that. You know, you talk about, it's not just people. The plot lines themselves were, if we want to say, ripped from the headlines. You know, we can. The disruption and war of the families in New York at around that time period, and the piece that they made in the Congress Hotel in Chicago. I mean, that's you know, those larger pieces happened, right? And you look at The Godfather Part 2, and you know, Meyer Lansky, who was portrayed in the movie as, you know, as Hyman Roth. Meyer Lansky did do quite a bit of work with the Cuban government to establish work and grow a base for gambling and these types of things in the excuse me, that's something I'll be cutting out. Let me write that down. 170. All right. He did you know, work with the Cuban government in an effort to grow a business down there, and they brought other families and other gangsters down to Cuba to discuss this. And Frank Sinatra came to perform for that particular meeting. I mean, these are historical things that that happened and can be confirmed. And I mean, I agree with you. That doesn't mean Frank Sinatra was a gangster, but it means that he rolled with some gangsters from time to time, and they, you know, he was certainly part of their circle for some of this some of these activities. So very, very closely aligned. And then, the Godfather. So the first movie and the turbulence between the families and some of the actions on how they were ultimately resolved. The Godfather Part Two with this partnership with Cuba, a foreign government that they had, and then mob interactions with the Vatican in The Godfather Part Three, also based on a true story.
Well, and uh, it was around the time of uh, The Godfather 3 when it came out, and Mark and I were going to school together in Madison at that time, and I had a book that was about the death of Pope John Paul the First, and it had it talked about evidence suggesting that Italian mobsters got rid of the Pope. And the character in Godfather 3, the Archbishop Gilday, the Vatican banker, that's based after a real person who worked in the Vatican, a priest or cardinal or bishop of some kind, who originally from Chicago. His name was Paul Marcinkus.
Yes.
And he was God's banker. And then the Kinzig character in The Godfather 3, he has a mustache and he's at the meetings at the Vatican and he's in Rome. That character was patterned after a real person named Roberto Calvi, who it was the Ambrosia Bank or Bank Ambrosia that he was involved in that had some shady dealings with the Vatican that were going to be endangered with the new policies that were supposedly going to be coming in with Pope John Paul I. And then the Lucchese character in Godfather Part 3 was patterned after a real guy in Italy whose last name was Gelli. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Gelli, who was a big shot in an organization that kind of had ties to the mob and ties to the Masons, called P2.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, Andy Garcia in The Godfather 3, at one point he mentions P2 as being involved, and there's no real elaboration on what that is or anything. But no, that the basic plot there about the death of the Pope was definitely patterned after real events that occurred at that time.
I don't recall which character it was, but at the end of The Godfather 3, one of the characters is shown having been hung from a bridge.
That's Roberto Calvi.
Yeah, that actually happened.
Yeah. That's real.
They didn't make that one up.
Yeah, the money was falling out of his pockets while he was hanging there. Yes, a true event.
Sending a message.
I think the interesting thing is in the movie, they actually kind of toned down the illegality of the transaction that they were working with. Just the notion of, look, we own this huge conglomerate, this European conglomerate Immobiliare, and we'll sell it to you. And, and the money that you're going to pay is going to help us make up this deficiency in our funds. When in reality, it was the purchase of counterfeit bonds. What was the actual deal that was being done with the mafia, again, to make up a deficit in the bank. There's a couple of really good books about that. It's got nothing to do with the movie The Godfather. They focus on that. God's Name is one. There's another one called God's Bankers that looks into that. And this Bishop Marcinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank, plays a pretty central role in all of them, and including they attempted to do some prosecution out of New York, and they just weren't able, believe it or not, to get the cooperation of the Vatican to kind of get the records that they needed and that type of thing. And that's setting aside the connection that some people believe around how it ultimately resulted in the death of John Paul I, which was a part of the movie Godfather Part 3 in that plot line.
How many days did he last?
But 28 was that 28 days for John Paul the First?
I don't recall off the top of my head, but it was along those lines. It was short.
There's probably a device I can pump a question into, and it will tell us. But but again, I think it's one of the interesting things that captures people about the entire Godfather trilogy is the notion that there are actual people and events that drive some. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of stuff put into here that isn't true, but still, that some of the underlying foundations of the plots and stuff are based on true events and actual people.
The one thing when we were talking about the Hyman Roth, kind of like Meyer Lansky's work down in Cuba and what they were trying to accomplish, that made me think about common imagery in the three films, and we've talked a lot about the actual content of the first film. I don't know if we're going to have a chance on today's podcast to get to 2 and 3, but we could talk generally about some common imagery while we still got a little time here. And when Michael and Hyman Roth are in Cuba for the meeting, and there's not just those two, but there's people from the United Fruit Company and the Federal
American Telephone,
that kind of thing, and they're going down the table, and the imagery, the manner in which it's filmed, is very similar to the meeting of the five families, at what we're calling the meeting at the Congress Hotel in the first movie. Very similar. The first movie starts out with kind of going back and forth between the family wedding, Connie and Carlo's wedding, and at the beginning of the second movie, there's the celebration of the first communion of Anthony, Michael and Kay's son, and it goes back and forth between sort of the festivity of that family gathering and then the meetings that Michael is having,
with Senator Geary,
and then he's got Frank Pentangeli waiting in the lobby and
waiting in a line.
So there's and then in Godfather 3, the beginning, it's that celebration after Michael receives the award from the Archbishop.
Yeah,
and it's the same thing.
It's a religious ceremony. A religious ceremony in the beginning of the second movie. A religious ceremony, wedding in the beginning. They all start off with a religious ceremony to kick things off.
And Enzo is there with a cake, and Johnny Fontaine shows up. But there's still, Michael is back in his office, and like Joey Zaza comes in, and he's got a stone in his shoe over Anthony and stuff. I mean, there's a format that Coppola stuck to in all these movies it's hard to. I mean, I separate Part 3 from the first two for a number of different reasons, but there are a lot of aspects of The Godfather Part 3 that fit relatively neatly into the format of the first two movies.
Yes. Absolutely. In fact, the studios had been trying for a long time to come out with another Godfather, but it really wasn't until Francis Ford Coppola got back on board with it, mainly for financial reasons. He was in some financial trouble, which is probably the only reason he did it in the first place. But
I think that's generally accepted. There was a combination of things. I mean, he did a movie called One from the Heart, which I've never seen, but that apparently just it financially was a problem.
Yeah.
And then also, I believe that he may have had some exposure in the lawsuits that arose following the filming of the movie The Twilight Zone, where
when the stunt person was
the,
killed, and
the John Landis, well, one of the actors and two child actors who, and just the filming circumstances weren't in compliance with the laws that applied relative to children being on set. And so those two issues combined, I think, and I don't know this for 100% fact, but Variety, he found himself, there's no question that there were financial pressures that made him decide, oh, what the hell, number three should be, we should do a number three.
But he clearly wanted then to, there was several screenplays that had been drafted and treatments that had been done and this type of thing, and he for the most part scrapped all of them and said, no, we're gonna roll into this same mold. Because you talked about the similarity between the meeting of the five families at the Congress Hotel meeting, the meeting in Cuba. There was also that meeting in the Vatican where they were discussing what's going to happen now. The same thing, kind of panning across the table and the different people that were there. These meetings are taking place that have a lot of people talking. That ends up having a lot of impact on what is happening.
The Vatican has rules. The Vatican has very old rules.
Old rules, exactly.
I hadn't thought about that scene in Godfather Part 3 at the Vatican. I think that's a good point. I believe Mario, regarding the screenplay, I believe that Mario Puzo, the author of the novel, was involved in the screenplay for Godfather Part 3.
Yes.
At some level.
Coppola brought him back into, to work on that. And that's really something about, the success of the book, The Godfather by Mario Puzo, which was late 60s, 67 or something that book came out, 69. That was incredibly successful. It was on the New York Times, bestseller for over a year. It held some record for the most purchased book, for some time, out of American publishers or whatever. It was incredibly successful. And interesting story, Puzo sold the rights for the movie for a song, like $10,000.
80.
Well, he was brought that 80,000 was when he was brought back in to help work on the screenplay. Wow. He actually sold the rights for like $10,000. It was something. He needed the money because he had some gambling debts, which is of all. He
needed to keep Luca Brasi away.
Yeah, and in the big scheme of things, from a screenwriter perspective, he wasn't going to make anywhere near what he'd made from his book sales, which, again, that was just an incredibly popular book. And because of that, I think there was a lot of anticipation for the movie, and, having him involved with the movie, I think was critical to meet the expectations that people had when that was it. And another interesting quote from Mario Puzo is that all the lines that were really important in the movie, I'm going to make an offer he can't refuse, and this type of thing, came from his mother. These were things that he had heard his mother say while they were growing up. I guess she was a tough, vicious, type woman, and all these different lines from these, just incredibly violent gangster men. Actually, they came from his mom. Is where he got the inspiration for a lot of it.
Okay. You get $12,500 with another $80,000 if the book was made into a movie.
Oh, okay. So there you go.
And the movie made $260 million.
Yes. Yeah, and again, was the best picture, and I'm sure there was some screenplay awards in there and that type of thing. And we've mentioned a couple times about how The Godfather 1 and 2 different, kind of just a different level than The Godfather Part 3. And we have spent most of our time, and we're going to come back and do another episode of this to focus on 2 and 3 a little bit more, because we focus primarily on number 1. But a lot of people who especially really enjoyed the Godfather series, and they've got these strong expectations of two amazing movies. I mean, Godfather 1 and Godfather 2 were amazing movies. They were not surprising that they were both selected as Best Picture in the years that they were there again, coming off this incredible success from the book and an understanding that Coppola did just a good job, right? With these movies, the characters were good. The Godfather Part 3, people are like, The Godfather Part 3 was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, nominated for 7 Golden Globe Awards, including Best Picture, right? That were in there. I think it grossed like $160 million worldwide on a $54 million budget.
Yeah,
it was a very successful, very acclaimed movie, but it's that expectations game when you're going against something so high and so elevated. So it's also, especially people that haven't seen the Godfather movies, obviously watch 1 and 2, but don't discard 3. It's not as good as the first 2, but that's a very high bar that you're being held to.
Well, I agree with that. And actually, I had to go back and watch it a second time, and which was time had passed between when I first saw it at the theater. Well, you and I went to see it together at the theater in Madison when it first came out. And while I liked it and I thought it was a good movie, it was in a different realm from the first two. But when I saw it later on, with the DVD or whatever, and I had seen the first two in between, seeing 3 at the theater and then watching 3 at home, and I was able to tie in the similarities, some of the characters, some things you had to really pay attention to kind of catch in terms of the fact that they did a relatively good job of maintaining the format of the first 2 movies. So I think that it is legitimate for people to watch all 3, like one after the other. Take a week to watch. I mean, because they're all 3 long films, but it's a legitimate sequel. It really is.
I think so. Yeah.
I tell you, before we leave conversation about the first movie, this is probably the only where I look at it and I really question the judgment of looking at whether it be Vito or Michael. And this is when they're going to transition from New York to Vegas.
Okay.
And basically they decide they're going to kind of box out Tessio and Clemenza and Tom Hagen from the work that's being done to create this transition. Now that seems to me to be a mistake. I don't see the value in boxing them out of that. Well, then what were they? Now, one of the outcomes of them boxing them out is it kind of pushed Tessio towards Barzini.
Right.
And I don't believe that would have happened had they not boxed them out of all of these conversations. But just based on how loyal they were to Vito at the time that this discussion was going on. So what are your thoughts on that?
Okay, Tessio and Clemenza, I believe that was a mistake. With Tom Hagen, the movie portrays it differently from the book. The whole point of removing Tom from the family business was he was going to be their lawyer in Vegas and he was going to be lily white clean.
Mm-hmm.
He was going to represent all of their new legitimate businesses in Vegas, and Vito did not want him tarnished in any way. And
well, don't you think that ship might have kind of sailed by then? I mean, he'd already been pretty wrapped up in the that does make sense, right? It's especially if the knowledge was we're going to start killing people. Right. I mean, if that was the plan, it's like, no, we're going to start,
and not just 1 or 2.
Yes, we're going to start killing people here, and we don't want you involved with that. I can see, I can see why moving Hagen out of that would be. I think I would have explained a little bit of that to him,
right?
As opposed to just you're out, which is how that meeting ended, where Mike's just like, hey, you're out. Now it sounds like
let
you
me
agree that. Okay, jump in, Mike.
let me interrupt here. I think, to Andrew's point, I think what, and Mark, you say that ship had sailed. Well, yeah, sure. Hagen had been involved in various things up to this point. He certainly, as Salazzo noted, I know you're not in the muscle end of the family, so I don't want you to be scared. And Vito says to Tom, when Michael first says, Tom Hagen will no longer be consigliere, he's going to be our lawyer out in Vegas. And Tom is like, why am I out? And Vito says, I advised Michael, the blah, blah, blah. They're for reasons, there are reasons why you cannot be part of what's happening. When Tessio gets whacked, that's before Michael has the heads of the other four families, Barzini, Tattaglia, Strachey, and Cuneo.
Yeah.
I think that maybe what Vito wanted Tom to be uninvolved in were those killings.
Sure. Oh yeah.
That's how the Lily White, or we want to clean. We don't want there to be any involvement that Hagen has with. Now that begs the question: well, if Michael was the client who was behind what Hagen was representing, he was very obviously the guy who gave the order, as they say, to do that. But I guess I do understand that. But that doesn't explain keeping Tessio, why Vito didn't let Tessio and Clemenza be more involved in what was going on, so that it wouldn't have given Tessio the incentive to do what he did with Barzini.
I think that was a huge mistake.
Yeah.
If I'd written the book, Vito would have sat down with Clemenza and Tessio alone in a room and said, you are never to repeat what I'm about to tell you, but Santino will be avenged. Michael's dead wife and Sicily will be avenged. We're going to have to take a few punches here, but be patient, because the day will come when Barzini and Cuneo and Strachey and Tattaglia are going to pay. And I think those two would have said, yeah, okay.
And it could have been that there was, because there was some uncertainty in the future of the family, regardless of whether they had a plan or not, right? There was a lot of land grabbing that was going on with the other families. There was some uncertainty about what was going to happen. There would have been a fear in Vito's mind that one of them was going to jump ship anyway. In fact, he talked with Michael about that. After I'm gone, someone's, and the person who comes to you with the meeting is all these people are businessmen, and that's what their loyalty ends up being. But that wasn't really the case with Vito. The loyalty of Clemenza and Tessio went deeper than just money. I do believe that while he was alive, they would have followed him into whatever fire that he would have said for them to go into. But he knew that the moment that he died, that loyalty was not going to be there for Michael. Necessarily going to be there for Michael. At some point they talked to Clemenza about their plans for the killings, because Clemenza did some of it, right? So, and I think it just was, look, we're gonna see who jumps, and then we'll, that may have been the case. It just seems that Vito didn't know when he was going to die, and he didn't necessarily know that he was going to die immediately soon, right? Obviously he did. He had a heart attack and died, but at the time he might have potentially lived for another 2-3 years. It would seem, that he would have continued to leverage the loyalty that he did have from Tessio and Clemenza, and would have looped them in on the plan. I don't think it was at that time a given that that they were going to go. However, if they had relayed their plans to Clemenza and Tessio, Vito dies, and now one of them runs, but now he knows, oh, by the way, don't show up on those, the court stairs on that day because you're going to be whacked, right? They would have had security up the ass, right?
Well,
from
that
that point.
Probably the most important point. If Vito lives, at some point, I mean, Vito knows Michael's planning this.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a secret. If Vito says, okay, I'm completely retired from the family business, and Michael says, well, you know, Dad, that oath to not break the truce, that was you, not me.
Yeah.
He whacks all those guys. Tessio and Clemenza, that Don is still alive, they're going to go along with him.
Yeah.
But yeah, as soon as Vito dies, now Tessio says, my personal loyalty was to Vito.
Yes.
Now,
yeah.
I always liked Michael.
Yes.
This is business.
Yes. Yep.
Well, and I think there's dialogue in the movie that suggests that Michael waited until his father died before taking the action. And it's
in the movie, yes. In the book, they make it clear that it would have happened. There was a time frame.
Okay, because
they were not anticipating Vito's death before making the move.
Well, and Vito's advice to Michael about, if, after I'm gone, someone you absolutely trust is going to come to you and say that, they've got a good deal and and if you go to that meeting, you're going to be assassinated. So it's, Vito was imagining him being gone and, Barzini and the rest of them still being there. So yes. I think that and like I say, I have not read. I mean, this conversation that we've had today, I'm more interested in reading the book than I think I ever been in the past because it will fill in some of the gaps in my understanding of these things.
I mean, that is something I'd advise, anybody that enjoys the Godfather movies and hasn't read the book. I mean, the whole notion of well, how do these people know they're going to be safe at these meetings? Well, that's because there's a family of negotiators. And by negotiators, meaning you're not going to take a hostage from the other family. You're going to take a hostage from this third party family. And if, they're not going to get released until the meeting is over and everybody's safe. And if someone gets axed, it's that family that's going to come after you. And I mean, explaining how that process works. No, they do not forgive.
That's a great part of the book.
Yes, I mean, and just kind of there's a lot of explanation of kind of the side ways that a lot of these things actually physically end up happening that they have to move through in a movie screenplay that's already a significantly longer amount of time than the studio was happy with. But so I still in looking at that's always been that decision to kind of like box these people out and do it in a way, again, even the way that it was done. If I can agree why Hagen was pulled out, but it seems like there was a way to do that wouldn't you're out, right? You're out, Tom. And I mean, that ended the conversation more rapidly, but I mean, this is someone that had been, very close, a part of the family, really. And very, demonstrated personal loyalty for decades. I found it interesting how the way that they shut them out.
Well, and once they were out in Vegas, as things started to play out in the second movie, in part 2, Hagen was right back. He was, I mean, how was his role not just sort of the conventional consigliere role? I guess, I mean, you didn't hear that term used.
Yeah.
But
that's what he was doing the same stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. He was as a practice. I don't know if the word consigliere is spoken in part 2, but that certainly seemed to be Hagen's role out in Vegas, or Lake Tahoe, as far as I could tell.
Oh, yeah.
But it just because the idea of Vito having planned the death of the heads of the other 4 families as vengeance, that was not something that I ever gleaned from the movie.
It's actually in the outtakes. They did film part of it.
Okay.
And as
a judge might say, it's the words that actually get into a law, not the words that the legislators talked about that you have to use.
First of all, you need to see. I own on Blu-ray the epic version, which is parts 1 and 2 in chronological order with additional footage. And the conversation in the backyard with Michael and Vito, Michael brings it up and he says, you promised there would be no acts of vengeance. I never promised that. And in the book, they go into a lot more about how Vito explains to Michael, none of these people have any personal loyalty to you. It's all to me. I've got to introduce you to the politicians and the judges and the people who are part of our organization, and you have to develop a relationship with them. And that's part of the transition is Michael has to build these relationships, and Vito dies before they really hit the point they wanted to hit where people are loyal to Michael.
Mm-hmm.
How much of what happens in part 2, both the Vito's earlier life, in Sicily and then in New York City when he's a younger man, and then going out to how much of that is in the book, The Godfather?
I think it's primarily the flashbacks, are what come from the first book, the youth and growing up and assumption of this role that Vito Corleone had. That was discussed in the first book, but any of the plot with an involvement of other things, they refer to a couple things, like in talking about the old days and that type of thing. But it was primarily the flashbacks that came from from the book.
Well, the book ends right after they move to Vegas.
Yeah.
So, but they do. You do get backstory in the book.
Okay, I understand.
Which is there. So, and then
and they talk about Sonny's first war. When he's in his 20s and the Olive Oil War takes place. And that's where he kicks ass. And that's when Vito's just like, oh, this kid can fight.
There's a lot more, of, again, kind of some backstory and other things behind, how things got to be the way they were. And then they delve deep into some of the characters that, are touched. I mean, the girl, the bridesmaid that Sonny is, sleeping with and banging up in the bedroom, and then he drops. I mean, after Sonny is killed, the family kind of gets her out to Las Vegas, and there's all this stuff with her that goes. I mean, they explore just a lot more in
Clemenza.
Yeah,
a lot more involved in Clemenza.
So it's I definitely, if you enjoy the movies, and you haven't read the book yet, I mean obviously it was a very good book just to start with. So certainly worth a read from start to finish.
Before we run out of time, one aspect of the first movie that we haven't talked about, and in kind of the context of was this a mistake, the way that Carlo Rizzi was handled by Vito and the rest of the family.
Oh yeah.
And the way that planned out. I mean, it's like, look, if Vito gave his blessing to Carlo to marry Connie, why was he sort of relegated to the kids' table? And because it ended up not working out in the family's favor. Sonny ended up getting killed because of it, and blah blah blah, and it might have embittered Carlo and caused him to treat Connie as badly as he did. I don't know, but was that a mistake? The way that they either allowed Carlo to come in or treated him after allowing him to come in?
I think that's one of those ones that, looking back, clearly it was a mistake because he caused a lot of turmoil and problems for the family because he just, he didn't have a whole lot on his own. So he was very easy for Barzini to come in and offer him more. However, I mean, I just get the sense that, and there's a little bit of this in the book, but not much. You can just get the same sense from the movie that Vito just didn't respect him. And you get a situation where, the mother is like, what are you going to do? Say she can't marry him? I mean, she loves this man. And you're going to say that, this is what's going to make her happy. So he's like, he's got to give his blessing to, for the marriage to happen, but he doesn't respect him. He's like, he's not very sharp, not very forward thinking, not a very good communicator, all the things that he's looking for if he's going to bring. And then as it turns out, he's also a wife beater. which wouldn't have flown very well with Vito either.
And well, and I guess that makes sense. You know, the idea and a conversation between Vito and his wife about that really would have been a very interesting. I mean, and that it wouldn't fit in the narrative. So I mean, it's not like I regret that wasn't in there, but that is. I guess I'm saying that I think your interpretation is
because you did
fairly
see,
accurate.
You did see when Sonny was giving Carlo a hard time, the mother stepped in and say, "Don't interfere.
Don't interfere.
Right? Don't interfere." So, you know, she was kind of as far as their marriage. I'm calling the shots on their marriage. So this is how things are. Yeah, we don't discuss business at the table.
Mike nailed it though. Why bring him into the family if you don't respect him and you're not going to give him anything worthwhile to do? And I can see, yeah, mom was insistent. No, this is the man that your beloved daughter loves. So Vito compromised.
Yeah.
Even though he knew better, he should have just said, no, I'll find you somebody I like to marry.
Yeah.
He caved into his daughter and his wife and brought in somebody that he didn't respect.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and kind of the corollary on the other kind of is the guy that Connie shows up with at the very beginning of part 2, and you know we're going to get married and book a
passage on the Queen.
Passage on the Queen, and like, well, why are you coming to me? You know, why don't you go to a travel? Well, because we need money. And you know, Michael's like, you know, I don't know this man. I don't know what he does. I don't know what he lives on.
Yeah.
And the idea of, look, if we're going to have to, you know, if we're going to have to provide your living, you know, there's going to be some parameters to it. And Michael was sort of like,
I want some input.
No way. NFW.
Yes.
You know, to Connie.
it's like, tell him you're done with him. Trust me, he'll understand.
Right. Mike, I'm going to ship you the Godfather epic. There's a scene where in Tahoe, I think it's after Michael talks to Connie and her boyfriend Merle, one of Santino's daughters brings in her boyfriend and they want to get married.
Oh, I have seen the clip you're talking about on YouTube. Yeah. I have seen that clip.
Huge difference because he's respectful. He's also wealthy. But the way he and Michael interact is totally different than the way Michael and Merle interact, and it makes for a great contrast.
No, I have seen that, and you're absolutely right. You know, it's like if someone had a little chat with Merle before going into that meeting and saying, here's how you should handle Michael. And by the way, do you have a source of income?
Other than his sister.
Yeah. Other than your soon to be blah blah blah. No, that's a great point. And I guess I would, and boy, I tell you, that's a big chunk of time. But I can remember when that came out. My roommate at the time, I was living in Milwaukee, and it was like 4 VHS tapes, maybe 5, and the whole thing together was like 8 or 9. It was just some ridiculously long. You know, he was watching it for like a whole week.
Mark and I watched it in one day, and it was like 6.5 hours or something insane. It was a day-long project.
Yeah, so...
but I'm going to send that to you so you can watch it.
Oh, well, I appreciate it. I'll watch it.
That'll give us some more insights. I think, like the movies, we're going to have a sequel of our conversation here. We're coming up on...
Since we barely got to Godfather 1.
Yeah, exactly. Much more to discuss, but we'll be back to take up this topic. Again, great movie, great lines, great characters, and a great conversation today, guys.
All right.
And there shall be the peace.
We will.
And there shall be the peace.